West through Hall, people. Welcome to the Heathen Bitches podcast. Today, I'm your host, Glade, with the other host, Fishy.
Fishy.
And the other host, Sigrun. That's the Sigrun sound. And today, we are talking about Woden. It's going to be a bit of a different episode, and we're going to make this disclaimer right out at the beginning. At the end of this podcast, we're going to have a little bit of like a prayer read to Woden, so that we can give people an idea of like praxis, where to start, some ideas of how it might look, you know, that kind of thing, because it's not really out there for ass shit. So here's a tiny smidget of it. That's going to be at the end of the podcast. We'll give you a warning before it is, because ritual consent purposes is important and shit, but just to let you know.
So today we are going to be discussing an amazing god. Well, I guess amazing, your mileage may vary. I don't know where the fuck I'm going with that. You might know him. You might love him. I know you Norse heads have a guy. You call him Odin, or Odin, because why not?
Often.
You call it Often.
Ah, thin. No.
So thin. Anyway, y'all know Odin, right?
I know Odin.
She knows Odin.
I met him at a bar once.
I know Odin.
Do you know Odin too?
I don't know who this fucking Woden guy is.
Oh, fancy that. So, since we're all English here, why don't you tell me about old English Woden?
So Norse has Odin. He's pretty well known. He's in some media here and there. Anglo-Saxon, we have Woden. He's a little less known, but he's in some names, like, you know, Wednesday.
Wednesday, Wansdyke.
It's the exact same person.
Definitely. There's definitely no differences here whatsoever. Oh, wait. You probably looked at the title of this episode by this point.
So, they're not the same, unfortunately. It would be nice if everything was nice and the same, but cognates do not mean same dude. Whoopsie daisy.
They are kind of the same in a lot of ways.
There's a fair bit of interesting ground that we can get into this today.
So he's a god. The myths, the few things that we've got are kind of similar to Odin in a lot of ways, but they're not exactly the same.
He is the centerpiece of our one non-euhemerized, non-completely Christianized myth about the gods.
And what is that myth called?
The 9 herbs charm. The 9 herbal charming.
Alright, the 9 herbs charm. So, it itself is kind of Christianized, but for whatever reason, in the middle of it, you know, it's just like little magical working thing where they're talking about like herbs and whatnot and their uses. We have a little narrative about a snake that slithers up and tries to bite someone. But then here comes someone named Woden with 9 glory twigs with stuff on them. And he comes up and he throws him at the serpent, more or less, and casts it into multiple parts, thus defeating that illness. It's a kind of a weird little narrative in the middle of what is otherwise just like, here's herbs.
Here's what they do.
The inclusion is an incredibly weird standout, which really explains a whole lot. It's both in character, honestly, and also it just explains so much about what little bits might have survived conversion regarding Woden lore.
I've seen people take that, like, one little blurb of a story and, like, run with it to all kinds of places. Like, there's a really common theory that the herbs were runes or had runes on them. I've seen it built into, like Zach, for example, we built it into his creation story narrative. Like, the parts of the snake became worlds. That's what you do when you have exactly one myth.
Yeah, y'all really... The second you said the only non-euhemerized myth you have is a charm about herbs, I was like, yep, I'm glad I'm not Ash. Because damn, that sucks.
You could be.
But when we say non-euhemerized, it's because we do see him kind of show up in other places. There is another poem whose name I can't remember. It's like Max. I think it's Maxims 2.
Yes, Maxims.
I want to say it's Maxims 2, where they bring up Woden Worte Wales. Basically, Woden builds shrines, temples, idols, or whatever, and contrasts him with the Christian God who makes the universe, basically. Like, they're accusing this heathen god of being a liar who just builds shrines to self-aggrandize.
They're just shitting on the pagan gods so that they can make the Christian god look better.
Yeah, which is, a very classic tactic.
It was also part of the Saxon baptismal vow that they had to renounce Woden.
Oh, yeah, and when we look at the continent, we see stuff like the baptismal vow, where it's Woden, Thunar, and Saxnot. But, yeah, and then, of course, there is the famous Merseburg charms of the continent, where Woden and Balder are riding around, and they see a horse, and it's like, oh, shit, we gotta heal this horse. And then a bunch of women show up, and they all heal the horse. It's classic.
Healing seems to be a common theme.
Ain't nothing people like more than healing a horse.
Hell yeah. And then, of course, we have the royal genealogies of multiple kingdoms where Woden is either on top or he was slid on top over a pre-existing top deity. Well, not deity. This was, again, very euhemerized to sort of claim, awesome, badass people were the ancestors of the modern at the time monarchies of England, until they all sort of became Wessex.
Yeah, you filthy pagans. You thought those stories were about gods? Nah, they were about my dad. My granddad. My granddad, who made me king of Christianity. Come here. Come in, join my kingdom. I promise I'll be just as good as my dad, my great dad, Woden.
There is one royal line that maintains Saxnot was their ancestor, which is interesting.
Yeah, though I think later copies slid Woden on top of Saxnot, which is kind of weird.
Interesting.
It is interesting because also further down the line, you'll see people trying to distance themselves from ancestry to Woden. Not that anyone actually has ancestry to Woden, but they'll add in a ton of ancestors that is not time-wise possible between Woden and some Christian figure to further distance themselves from it. So let's talk about this Woden guy, and I think the best way to do that is to start talking about Odin, because he's got a lot of myths, too many myths, way too many myths. Hold on, dude, you've got 100 myths, maybe not 100. I don't know. I don't have the count on myths. Okay, I'm not a myth librarian, but there's too many. And in these myths, we'll see Odin portrayed as this wandering god who is in search of knowledge, a practitioner of magic, which maybe makes him gay. Or at least socially the connotations of it. We'll get into that later. Odin has this association with ecstatic rage, this fury of being drugged up and fighting people, associations with healing and shapeshifting, being an absolute dickwad to people.
Yeah, the part where he gives some peasants a magic scythe, and then they fight over it and end up accidentally killing each other with it, and then he just fucking leaves.
Or he just pretends to be some farmer, and then when the Hrolfkraki and his group are really nice to him for a while, and then when they come back, they don't have time for him because, they're on their way back from a raiding, and they just did a great raid. He goes and curses them. Fucks about that. We don't know that that's Odin, but it's pretty apparent.
Heavily implied.
The interpretation should be that's Odin.
Some guy runs up, shoves a sword into a rock or something, and it points to all the nearby heroes. If you can pull this, you'll conquer a whole lot of shit, guys. And then a bunch of guys try and fail, and then Sigmund, I think, does it. He gets a sword. He becomes a Chad, conquers shit, and then he ends up dying in battle. So Odin shows up, grabs him, and grabs the sword. It's plan worked.
Yeah. So Odin is King Arthur, or not King Arthur. Whoever put the sword in the stone in King Arthur. I don't know. These are some things about Odin. Odin does a lot, and we have a lot of information about Odin. And with it, we can gather some information about Woden in the way that we discussed earlier in the PIE episode about looking at cultures that are close geographically and chronologically. But it doesn't mean that we can take everything from Odin and just translate it onto Woden.
Yeah, one thing in particular that is not really translatable from the Norse into the Old English or really any other heathen culture. We want to talk about Valhall.
Oh yeah.
The whole idea of like the death, like the royal death warrior shit, Ragnarok, and all that kind of stuff. Like those things don't really exist in any surviving Old English literature or any other Germanic people really don't seem to have that.
Not only they don't exist in literature, but there's not even like a cognate word for them.
No. There's
Are you telling me that Valhall isn't a real place?
Yeah, so there have been people who have tried to reconstruct a Valhall. It's fake. Don't believe their lies.
Insert shocked Pikachu face.
I know, like, some people, like fucking Stephen Paulington in his Elder Gods, brought it up in the very first episode, tries to do that shtick, and,
He does a lot of Norse importation.
A lot.
And to be fair, the reason that we see so much Norse shit pushed onto Woden and pushed onto Ash in general is just because of accessibility of sources, and then people being like, oh, it's the same, even though they're separated by, a sea and also so many years.
Many years. It's just the one thing that should be remembered when we're discussing like the differences between Anglo-Saxon religion and Norse religion. The English kingdoms converted by roughly around 700. The Viking Age is dated traditionally to like 796 to 1000. At the very least, that's 100 years. The conversions are, of course, happening much earlier. So let's say like 100, 150 years between the end of Anglo-Saxon religion and the primary sort of like height of what the fuck the Norse were doing.
Where we get the myths from, basically.
Most of the Scandinavian myths, the earliest forms of those poems tend to be from like the 9th, and that's really stretching it.
Yeah.
Most of it's from like the 10th, the 11th. Even after conversion, a lot of those stories are written after.
Sorry.
Fucking Snorri. To put it plain and simple, the Anglo-Saxons England had been Christianized for a long time by when the Viking period had started. Or got into its heyday. Like, started as a loose thing whenever we're talking history.
Yeah.
We were talking a little bit before the podcast about, like, does Odin trying to stop Ragnarok actually exist outside of, like, Snorri-influenced sources and the Eddas? The
sort of quest to prevent Ragnarok feudally, I might add, because that's the whole story of Ragnarok.
Yeah.
It's kind of present. A lot of times it's implied, like, Odin's hunt for the best warriors for fucking Valhall. That is pretty much connected to Ragnarok lore. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but a lot of the time it is. He's gathering all the best warriors in the world to fill his Valhall so that one day...
Rest in peace, Fishy. I can't believe you did that to us.
It wasn't me.
That was not him. That was me.
No, it was Fishy.
It's always
Canon.
my fault.
Anyway, where was I?
You were talking about filling Valhall. Or, sorry.
Oh, yeah,
filling Valhall with all the best warriors. I'm sorry.
Well, Odin is filling Valhall with his best warriors to prevent, or at least protect himself when the day of Ragnarok comes. Those ideas do kind of exist, but they're in later stories. A lot of which, of course, only seems to exist after the conversion period of Scandinavia. So it becomes very fraught to really decipher what's true, what's not true.
In massive air quotes.
Yeah. What is from the original period where pagan religion in like Iceland and whatnot was thriving, and where it was more or less being subsumed by Christianity.
Why don't we talk about things we do know about Woden?
So while earlier we brought up like things like the Nine Herbs Charm, the Maxims 2, there's a couple other poems that might kind of indicate a Woden thing,
Mercurius
like
the Giant.
Needseath. Oh yeah, there's Mercurius the Giant. We'll get back to him in a second. There's poems that suggest his Woden's presence, and then there's of course the stuff that directly mentions him. And what we can see from what survives in Old English lore, we do get a sense of wandering. Like, he does not seem to be a guy who stays in place. That much is pretty connected with with a lot of Norse stories where he's just kind of fucking all over the place. He's a healer. He knows his herb lore. Again, Nine Herbs Charm, knows his herb shit.
Ash has too much on herbs. They like their herbs.
Have a fungus.
Really do, baby. Have a fungus. He seems to have some connection with building, actually. In the west country of England, there is a fortification that is known as Wansdyke, or Woden's Dyke. Woden's Dyke in Old English. It was a structure they attributed to Woden when they came in, because it was apparently there when they arrived, and it was so, like, awesome. Like, this is a good fortification. We can use this to protect against the Britons. It's Woden. He did it. It seems to be a thing, associating Woden with building some pretty random, awesome shit. Again, let's bring up Maxims 2. Woden built shrines, built temples. Woden seems to be a bit of a weird builder.
He's a carpenter, like Jesus.
It's true. I met him.
Anyway, so we have Woden as a kind of a weird builder. Then we have something that is more like Odin, association with runes and letters and writing. There is, of course, from the rune poem, where the Os rune directly mentions Os is the source of all speech. If we look at the Icelandic rune poem, which is, related, we see Os being deliberately referred to as Odin.
That particular rune poem is Christianized to mean mouth, but the word os in Old English literally means a god. So, along with the Icelandic rune poem, it, a god associated with, like, words and knowledge and stuff like that, it seems to indicate Woden.
Yeah, and that's further strengthened by another couple poems that we call Solomon and Saturn. Sort of like these sort of wisdom debate poems that are kind of like Eddic poems like Vafthrudismal, where it's just two guys arguing. I say Vafthrudismal specifically because it is Odin and Vafthrudisnir arguing. And one of the riddles is, like, tell me, who invented letters? I tell you, Mercurius se Gigant. Mercurius is an interesting point, because the Romans and, learned Latin writers often conflated Woden or Wodan or Odin or Wodanaz, if we go into the Proto-Germanic, with Mercury. Mercury was a wanderer who was involved with psychopomp shit. That comparison alone gives us multiple hints, not just the inventing letters bit, like a sort of association with death, which is also kind of true of Odin, but probably less warrior, rah, skull, Valhall shit.
We like our skull Valhall shit. Well, a lot of us don't like the Valhall shit or the skull shit, but there's some scholars out there.
Some scholars.
Scholars.
Yeah, real scholars. Not like those pussy-footed scroll-reading individuals. Scribes? Nah, we got scholars over here in Norristown, New England.
Yeah, we have a cognate for Valkyries in Old English, but it doesn't seem to hold the same connotation as Valkyries in Norse.
You can't even really say that like the Norse Valkyries, the Valkyrier, that they're distinctly connected with Woden. It's a good guess.
They're both associated with, like, corpses and battles, I suppose, but not necessarily with each other.
Yeah.
The idea that's populated is that they take the slain to Valhall.
The Valkyries.
Were you talking about the Valkyries?
The association with the Valkyries is that
shit.
they're, I think it's described somewhere as, like, corpse-stealing witches.
corpse-stealing witches as glosses for deities like the Roman Bellona, which is a murderous, killing goddess of war.
Very different from the psychopomp organ machine grinders that are
Not
the Valkyries
necessarily.
of Norse myth. Not necessarily. Or do you have organ machines?
Well, nothing described, but the name Wal is cognate with Vol, and it means slain. And there are a couple poems which do kind of hint at being annoying warriors on the battlefield, so there seems to be some similarity.
I'm not gonna lie, you just taught me something. Last episode I learned that wheels existed.
We both learned about
this
wheels.
episode, I'm learning that Vol and Wall means slain.
Yep.
Yeah, I didn't.
Valkyria. Chooser of the slain.
No, that makes a lot more sense.
Somewhere. I thought it was Boss Bertolder, but maybe I'm wrong. It's used as a gloss for Furies.
Oh yeah, I forgot to mention the Furies as well.
Oh, that makes sense.
So you have a lot of areas where you can look at the Valkyrian for, and just to sort of glimpse what they could be. Not necessarily just Odin's pet psychopomps. The only thing we can definitely say is they were probably very horrific to deal with. There's one other good conversation that we can have with this. The idea of a high deity.
Odin, All-Father, King of the Aesir. Yeah, this is a thing. Definitely not just myth.
Let's have the high god tangent quickly.
Tangent.
This might come...
I thought that was what was happening.
We're starting it with that.
Okay.
Fishy, go off, King.
Oh, shit. Was Woden the high god? Motherfucking probably, maybe? Because, we see him in royal genealogies, and we see him associated with, kingship, with, the Sutton Hoo helmet and shit like that. And, he shows up in place names. He's obviously super fucking important. But there's a really common just assumption that he was the high god in Ash, and I think it's mostly just taking that from Odin. And I think the better assumption is probably that maybe the high god myth varied from tribe to tribe and place to place, because there's also a good case to be made for Tu as the high god, with the Marx Thinxus inscription and shit, and the origin of his name and shit like that. And maybe even Saxnot with also again the royal genealogies.
Oh yeah, Saxnot definitely would be a case. Ing would be a very good sort of pinpoint for a high god, especially since a lot of the peoples were known as the Ingwine, the friends of Ing, not to be confused with our boy Ingwine.
And this is a good point to Renshin? I'm not Scooby-Doo right now. This is a good point to mention that again, looking at cultures that are nearby, even if the time period's a bit different, the high god is not the same all throughout Scandinavia. For the most part in the myths that we have recorded, yeah, it's Odin. But when we look at Sweden, you tend to see more of Freyr or the Ing cognate, Ingvi Freyr, being the king, the high god that people are associating with, and then naming the kings the Inglings. It varies from place to place, and honestly, here's the big part of the tangent. It doesn't really matter for reconstruction.
It really does not.
Because... Oh, go ahead. I was going to go off, but you can go off.
I think, honestly, we're all going off today on this. For starters, the whole idea of needing a high god, that's kind of that's a severe remnant of a time when, society had kings and earls and all that shit.
We're not Theodes. We don't need a divine right of kings.
Don't need a divine right of kings. We don't need...
Well, unless you're British.
Are you saying Queen Elizabeth is descended from Woden?
The Queen of England, or rather, I'm sorry, the King of England, get fucked, idiot, is the leader of the Church of England. They still hold a theological role in the ongoings of the UK.
And also, they are descended from the House of Wessex, which claimed descent from Woden. So,
holy shit, we're cracking the code.
You're cracking the code.
That's why she died. She joined Valhalla. That's what's happening.
Skull.
Queen Elizabeth is gonna fight with Betty White out on the battlefield against, I don't know, Loki?
Loki.
Elizabeth will slay Loki.
This is new myth.
Gods.
Anyway.
No. So the point being, it's kind of silly to reconstruct a high god. Or not silly. Like, there's some benefit to it, I suppose, if it gives you benefit. But for the most part, it's a remnant of a time gone past. In reality, there's no reason to believe that any one god has more sway over the rest of the gods than any other.
If you're writing myth, and especially like myth that's deliberately archaic, you can definitely do it. But like you don't need to, and like you could have any sort of like structure for your sort of cosmogony if you want. Like I have 3 deities, which sort of serve as like the ruling triad.
Morrowind moment,
and that works for me.
I also have a ruling triad. But like this is the thing where we have to make that distinction of mythology. Yeah, could be interesting symbolism, could tell us some things. It is useful for the plot. Is it anything that's like true to life, true to experience?
Your mileage may vary.
And again, if you're getting hung up on the reconstruction here, like the myths might make it seem like all the Norse held Odin to be the high god for like the longest fucking time, but realistically, when you look at like other cultures and even the Norse outside of the myths, it probably varied a lot between various different gods and various different times and places.
Right, and also it's like we only have a small fraction of myths remaining. So the myths that got recorded, people are going to want to be consistent.
Yep.
Snorri's writing a book. He ain't trying to write 30 different storylines. Snorri lines,
cinematic universe,
with 30 different settings.
Snorri cinematic universe.
Gosh, the Heathen Norse paganism is just the SCU
canon.
Or would it be the Snorri literary universe?
Slew.
I'm a big Slew fan. I'm a ramp girl.
Bringing that back.
Bringing it back. 2023, year of the ramp girl. I think we've sufficiently destroyed the rant that we have about high god gods, because there's not a ton to talk about there. It's just important to mention. I think what is going to be a good segue into talking more about like specific myth and folklore about Woden is really quick. There is something that needs to be breached that we may have forgotten about in planning, and that is one of the names that people give Woden. That is a focused dog whistle because it's not real.
Oh shit!
Wotan.
Oh, Voltan.
Which is spelled W-O or Voltan. These are both of them. W-O-T-A-N stands for Will of the Aryan Nation.
Okay, so that one does require a bit of explaining. It's a bit of a tangent. Of not like we're any strangers to tangents here on the show, but so essentially, there's the word Wotan. It is German. It might have existed historically in, again, German areas. Probably not. The oldest sources are like much later Latin stuff, and they're probably just writing as they saw. Most names in Germany, most of like the names of that associated with this deity in Germany were more like Wodan or Wotan. Not Wotan or Voltan. Wotan in particular comes about really with Wagner, with Richard Wagner, who made a bunch of, really kick-ass operas. He was a fucking brilliant genius man. He was an anti-Semite. Definitely not a pleasant man. Nietzsche, for one thing, really wanted to fucking murder him. To bring that into reference. And Wotan sort of became very popular among a certain crowd. You might know them today as Nazis. They really loved Wotan. They really fucking loved Wotan. And there's another guy called Carl Jung who really loved Wotan. Jung writes an article about how Wotan is a sort of psychological thing that runs behind the spirit of Germany unleashing itself from its chains, basically. Like the sort of untapped primal spirit of Germany. And he sort of slightly points it at Hitler himself. A lot of people really went with the Hitler comparison, and it sort of just kept going in neo-Nazi circles after the war, and infected many strains of heathenry. Because, if you don't know, a lot of heathenry really fucking Nazi.
I think the reason that Wotan gets used in place of like Odin or Woden is because of folkish theology, which is weird and all over the place because half of them are atheo-pagan, half of them are like theists, but theism is like second. Basically, the reason is that they don't draw cultural lines between different Germanic cultures. They basically just say, all these gods were the same, and we're going to use the German name because it's German, and also we can turn it into a fucking acronym. And for reference, that spelling of Wotan didn't appear until a 12th century Latin manuscript, which was way, way after Christianization.
So now that we've gotten that sort of like warning out of the way, let's talk about other bits of folklore and, modern lore and shit, like stuff that has been influenced by getting really into the knee deep into this shit, or stuff that influences us in return.
One thing that people can't really nail down alongside the high god thing is whether or not Woden was depicted with one eye, because there's like a good bit of art of Woden, like not a huge amount, but there's some pieces here and there, and like half of them he definitely has two eyes, and half of them one of the eyes is all fucky, so the implication is there. And then there's the Sutton Hoo helmet, which has a glare built into one eye but not the other one, and is also loaded with Woden imagery.
Inconsistencies in fan art is one of the most frustrating things about religion.
Fan art.
Not even a comment.
I guess we're just gonna leave that.
So yeah, it's probably similar to the high god thing, where the myth probably varied from place to place. Maybe he had one eye in some places and didn't in others.
Yeah.
It's not all that important. Again, things that, it doesn't make much a difference. If it matters to you, pick a side. If it doesn't, don't tell anyone else to pick a side.
Just make more consistent fan art, honestly.
Be self-consistent. Your depiction is not going to be the same as everyone else's, because you are shit at art. Sorry, hate to break it to you. It's just what it is. You're not as good as Bragi. Myth and folklore, things that have inspired us. There's this one thing in the Woden myths that well, maybe not in the Woden myth. I don't fucking know. The wild hunt we should talk about.
Oh, hell yes, the wild hunt.
Yes, Woden is considered the leader of the wild hunt in a lot of folklore.
Mm-hmm. It's pretty cool, so if you don't know what the wild hunt is, it is a folkloric motif in huge parts of Europe, where there's like a guy leading a host of other guys across the sky, and they if you're in the way, they kill you, and they do a lot of shit,
or transport you with them, or something
like they are very associated with like death and dark winter times. There's kind of varying evidence towards the existence of this wild hunt. The oldest sightings are from like 1200s, so it might not even be pagan. I'm not really sure, but it is still a weird bit of thing that it seems to be associated with a certain guy. Actually, a bunch of guys. In some places, it is not Woden. There's like an association of Arthur in some parts of Britain for some reason.
But
some various outlaws.
Yeah, and there's Herne the Hunter in some parts of England, and there's Frau Holle in areas of Germany. I think, yeah. I'm sticking with that. Someone will correct me later.
Hey, Sigrun. Why do they call it the wild hunt?
Because of a man called Jakob Grimm, who compiled a whole bunch of folklore from across the Germanic sphere in his attempt to do a nationalist nonsense in Holm. and he had assigned
Oh shit!
because welcome to Germanic studies.
I thought it was supposed to be like ecstasy or something.
Well,
I thought this was a well, kinda.
because we are going to get a bit into etymology now, I guess. So some of the hunts are known as the Wild Hunt, but in parts of Germany, as he noted, they came under the name Wotendis Heer, basically the furious host. Wut, fucking German. Wut in Wotendis is directly cognate with Wold and Odin. So, and it means furious, frenzy, all those sorts of things. And this is an interesting sort of note because, Wold and Odin, all of those descend, as linguists have discovered, from a common Proto-Germanic word name, Wodanas, which means frenzied one, ecstatic one, mad one, those sorts of things. And we, like in a previous episode, in the Eton episode, we discussed how etymology is not necessarily like indicates something's meaning in a later language. However, as late as Adam of Bremen in the 11th century discussing religion in Sweden, he refers to it as Wodan it est furor. Odin, that is fury, frenzy. So we do, from antiquity into the medieval period, an association between these different figures with some sort of magical madness or something like that. So there is definitely a static shit.
There's also a lot of association with the Wild Hunt, with them having a band of spirits that they lead around. So it's potentially another death association there.
Oh, most likely, at least.
Well, also a death association, because if you get caught up in it, you die or go somewhere else, presumably with the dead. There's nothing I like more, honestly, folks, than men leading other men in spirits into the sky and just picking up stragglers along the way. That's a good time. That's a good Christian time right there. That's America at its finest. Me and the boys leading others to their death in the sky.
That's another funny thing about the Wild Hunt is that it's such a strong motif that it survived not only all through Europe, but it made it all the way to America.
Ghost Riders
where we sort of cowboyified it.
In the sky. Sig song counter up.
Johnny Cash, Ash confirmed.
Based.
Them old wild folks went riding out one dark and windy day. I'm not going to do that.
Anyway, so let's discuss another interesting bit of like modern stuff that might be connected, and y'all might know this. Wizards. A very specific wizard.
The ones from Waverly Place.
No.
Damn it.
Not at all.
Dumbledore.
By extension, kind of.
Maybe. Less turfy.
Who else is a wizard? Merlin.
Someone has argued some link there, but also not necessarily.
Fuck, we're talking about Gandalf, aren't we?
Yes.
Gandalf
the Grey.
He's Woden.
Yeah, basically. He's pretty Woden, guys.
Tolkien. J.R.R. Tolkien. Professor Tolkien.
What a lad.
Guy who saved Beowulf. Also wrote some fiction. Pretty good fiction. In it, he had a wizard. He called him Gandalf. It's a Norse word, yes, Gandalf and Gandalfr. But he makes this wandering wizard figure. He's not very rulerly. Like, in fact, the more rulerly wizard in his, short little story we call The Lord of the Rings, is a dick. Who betrays everyone and gets fucking killed by his servant in the end after trying to do the Industrial Revolution to the hobbits.
Wait, what? I've not watched The Lord of the Rings yet.
What
happens to the hobbits?
This is not in the movies.
Okay, context for everyone. In the middle of doing this episode, or not in the middle, I'm currently watching Lord of the Rings for the first time. And I saw the first movie, and oh my gosh, is Gandalf so Woden. Gandalf is Woden to the max. Like, if I could picture a Woden with both eyes, it'd be Gandalf.
Also, since we're talking about Tolkien, it's worth pointing out that his leader of the Valar, the Lesser Gods, was Manwë, which he originally wrote as Woden.
Yes.
Did it get cut by like an editor or something?
Nah.
No, he just changed his mind. Well, he's known for doing that.
Not even so much as changed his mind, it's just not really brought it up again, because this is part of his original framing story for his Legendarium, where an Anglo-Saxon adventurer came across elves who told him about, all the ancient lore, and he's like, oh shit, that's Woden.
I believe he was the father of Saxnot in Tolkien's writing.
I'm not 100% sure. I would not be surprised.
I have to double check on that. He did some Ash myth building.
Kinda, yeah. So, yeah, Tolkien included, Gandalf, who very consciously, he even described it as Odinic, but he doesn't really, but because of, as the stuff we've discussed, with, the Norse Odin's association with Valhalla and all that dying warrior shit, because Gandalf does not have that, a lot of Ash today really see him more as their guy.
And Tolkien was an Anglo-Saxon professor.
Yeah, he was a professor of Anglo-Saxon. He was, like I said, he's the guy who saved Beowulf from being just another thing for people to look at instead of, an actual work of art.
Another thing I wanted to bring up earlier was the twin ravens. There's actually a little bit about Woden having the twin ravens, because there's a depiction of him with horns. I actually see that a lot, and horned warriors being associated with Woden, where the horns come up and form two bird heads. So it's, potentially like a Hugin and Munin kind of thing.
Yep. But, of course, like a lot of other things, we would not have their names because no one wrote about it, or if they did, that probably got lost when a monastery got sacked by a bunch of fucking filthy Vikings.
You could build an Old English cognate, but there's no evidence that that's what they would be called. Skull.
I hated doing that.
I think we should talk about whether or not, because this is a question a lot of people have, whether or not they're theologically the same being.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point.
Yeah.
So,
spoiler alert: we don't fucking know.
Yeah, pretty much. You could pretty much go on many different sides on that. Basically, the thing that we've been getting at this entire time is that, in terms of how Woden was seen, and how, especially modern day, which we'll get into it a bit soon as well, Woden and Odin aren't necessarily the same in terms of how they're treated, but are they actually the same? But are they actually completely different deities? It doesn't have to be. That really depends.
This is a point where this should become a question of your own personal praxis and not something to talk about, or not something to push on other folks.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, the myths are wonderful, and the way that people understand the gods is wonderful, but the way that you understand the gods is going to be very different to the way that I do and the way that other folks do. And really, the best way to gain information is through experience, because we can't know much with certainty. Sorry, you're in the wrong religion for that. Mm-hmm. If you see enough of a distinction and you feel enough of an experience that it's different, it's perfectly valid to hold them as different deities. If you think, yeah, they're similar enough in myth, and I tried giving an offering to them and it didn't seem to feel any different, it's perfectly fine to put them together. If you're going to have an opinion, I think you should inform it with experience, but an opinion based off myth is also equally valid, especially if you don't have a praxis with either of them.
If you want to play it super fucking safe, you can use one's name as a kenning for the other, which is what I do.
Yeah, because Fishy's a Danelaw, Anglo-Saxon.
True.
Anyway, the point is, theologically, we cannot know. And so what's best is to make your own belief, or to not make your own belief, but to have your own belief, and then work with that.
And there is precedent in historical polytheist theologies for gods being treated based on, or differently based on how they're addressed, and having different associations based on how they're addressed. I think the Romans did this.
Hell, that's pretty much all of Cometicism.
Yeah.
That's all Cometicism. The Romans and Greeks both had the idea of epithets, where having a different epithet to a deity would be addressing a different sort of idea, aspect, whatever the fuck. There's also the fact that, especially like the many different Greek colonies, this is something I use a lot when I'm making comparisons. You know, like the Zeus of Athens and the Zeus of, say, Syracuse. They might be the same, but they're probably still seen somewhat differently by the Syracusan whatevers and by the Athenians. Like, there's differences between the two. It's just that because they share the name, they might be seen as the same, they might be seen as different. Can't really say.
And Germanics probably had the same, like, symptoms. It's just a byproduct of the fact that the Icelandic Norse myths are the only ones that survived that make it seem so, like, homogenous to us.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you gotta remember, again, that, like, people live in different towns, and even within the same town, people have different opinions. It's almost like human thought has never been a monolith in the entirety of our civilization or history, and prehistory. So I think this is a good time for us to start talking about, like, y'all's individual practice with Woden. To give an example of, like, how do you approach a deity where we have so very little, like we do in most all of Ash, and I should not qualify that, in all of Ash. How do you start this praxis?
Hi. I am probably like the biggest worshiper of Woden in this space. Certainly.
Big Woden nerd.
Massive Woden nerd. Woden and his wife Free, who we'll bring up in another episode. They are my two primary deities that I worship and reference. A lot of my activities are devotional poetry to Woden. Because, you know, while that's not something that's directly attested, it's something that I vibe with a lot from, like, the Norse stuff, and it makes sense because, again, inventor of letters, he'd probably really love that sort of thing. I write a lot of poetry, and the majority of, like, my offerings are to Woden as both inspiration, as sort of health because of the herb thing. Like, I sort of see him as a healing deity as well as the poetry deity, and just like a lot of my sort of nerd shit, a lot of my sort of research pursuits and whatnot, I tend to sort of view as being in the same vein as him. Like, I do kind of see him not like as the high deity, but as a triad, as I mentioned earlier, with Tew and Ing, sort of like representing the cool shit. I see him as a death deity as well. Like, he is a psychopomp figure who with his host of Valkyrian, gathers the dead and deposits them at Hell's Gate. Especially during the winter, when there's, when historically there was a lot more death in winter because cold and famine and all that. And yeah, that's probably the best gist that I can give without getting super rambly. I do rune charms. I do a lot of shit that is dedicated to Woden.
It's Woden time.
I love it when, you're looking at that 9 herbs charm and Woden goes like, it's Woden time. And then you go, wode all over the place.
Based.
Fishy, you want to talk about yours? You don't have to.
Let's see. A lot of my Woden practice was initially built off of coming out of Norse heathenry into Anglo-Saxon, which is part of the reason I brought up, are they the same deity or not? Because I carried over a lot of my Odin practice, but, it changed shape with the changing of Woden, which I think is, kind of analogous to them changing shape from one deity to another. A lot of my practice is very season-based, because the seasons where I live are really pronounced. So, like, spring is a lot of Aestra, summer is a bit Wada, because I spend a lot of time in the ocean, and then winter is more Night and Mona, and also Woden, because like Sigrun said, an association with winter and also the wild hunt, supposedly riding during the winter. So I usually do a ritual to Woden at the first full moon of October. Also, doing runic divination and like prayers for like healing and things.
Oh yeah,
with the healing
divination. Yeah.
Those are usually associated with Woden as well.
And I don't have a praxis with Woden. I've got like the tiniest of one with Odin, but I don't see them as the same. So it's not relevant.
Based either way.
Yeah. Plus, it's hyper localized. Like it's not something that would be applicable to anyone here. It's not historical.
You could come up with a Floridian name for both of them.
I don't have to come up with a Floridian name because otherwise they'd be known as like Steve and actually Steve isn't that Floridian a name. It'd be like Chris and Marco. You decide which is which. Thank you all for coming with us on this journey. It's not quite over yet.
Wait, before we close out, I want to talk about the Yule ritual. Because me and Glade just got back from Yule, and I did an ash ritual there, and Sigrun wrote a long-ass poem for it that Glade read, so that's going to be up on the channel soon. There was an invocation to Woden.
We've talked a lot about Woden today, and what we're going to do now is we're going to do a little prayer, and you're going to be like, well, why are you doing a prayer? This ain't church. This ain't church service. This ain't a pagan commune or some shit. I hear your thoughts, Rocky Balboa. I really do. But this is a way for folks to have a first interaction with the deity. If you want to, you can join in and just listen along or say it in your head. If you don't want to, leave the episode now. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks for listening to us. We love you dearly. Maybe not that last part. You're random people. But we do enjoy that you enjoy us.
To those of you who are still here, welcome to the first ever God episode ending prayer. This is something that we plan on doing with every deity that we bring up, where mostly the two Ash of us, Fishy and I, write out, prayers, most in our different styles, to the deities that we worship, as a sort of example of what you can do, and just also to give you sort of a taste of the vibe.
Just you wait until I write one about Wada, and you're gonna be like, "Are you Ash?" And I'm gonna be like, "Nope."
Hell no, I just want him.
Hell no.
This is something that I wrote up. Lower your heads and extend your hands, or however else you may find yourself in the headspace of prayer. It doesn't really matter. Now you may repeat after me. Hail to the Hyesa. From heaven you reign. Hail, graceful goddesses, the glories of the world. Hail, elves ever wild, through winter and summer. Hail, Sunne. Hail, Molna. Hail, sacred ancestors. Hail, divine above us. Hail, divine below us. This will be a brief prayer to the One-Eye, to the Mad Witch, to Woden, who works wondrous shrines and great temples, who knows every herb in the land, and taught man how to use them against the serpents of illness, who crafted the runes from his noose and gave them to us, that we might write our words of praise to the Asa and record our own mad wisdoms. West through Woden Hall, the witch carved into the herbs his rune lore, 9 runes for 9 herbs to heal the sick ones who hear his wise words, whispered in their ears such ancient verses of lore that will leave them with life ever flowing. Hail, Woden, hail! Thy wisdom thou grant today with desired mind that driveth mankind onward. May those wise souls my words they hearken, and find themselves full of his fury for lore, that we all his wisdom share, west through Woden Hall. We thank you for listening to our episode, and hope you have a pleasant rest of your time on this fair midden yard. Beo Yazund, mine friend, and good day.